Oh, calm down. It's just a joke. Okay, so this month's LGBTQ plus related video is going to be a little bit more tangential than usual. Because while the topic that I'm about to talk about does touch on LGBTQ plus representation, and I'll be using those kinds of examples, overall, this is about the biggest and broadest version of a core question, and it stretches beyond those. And that question being, who can make what jokes? Now, what got me thinking about this is that earlier this year, I made a guest appearance on a podcast that a friend of mine and occasional guest on this channel, Ryan Daly, puts out. It's called Cheers Cast, and on it, he's going through every episode of the sitcom Cheers and talking about each of those with a guest. The one he had me on for was from season 1. It was an episode called The Boys in the Bar. Now, it's an episode structured very centrally around gay men and the concept of gay bars and the prejudices that come out of some of the characters when it comes to those topics. Ryan was very upfront with me about the fact that he had me on because I talk about LGBTQ plus representation and am part of that community, gender fluid if you didn't know. And Ryan being a straight cis guy, he didn't feel comfortable making determinations about whether or not the jokes in the episode were offensive or held up. And even if it wasn't the ideal perspective, since I'm not a gay man, but hey, you work with the circle of friends you have. So having this conversation with Ryan got me thinking more about the minefield of what jokes are or aren't okay to tell. And I'm sure this topic won't incur any wrath from anybody at all. Aren't uncontroversial topics fun? Chapter 1. No Laughing Matter. So the first thing that needs to be acknowledged is that this issue, quite simply, doesn't have an easy answer. And that in and of itself actually contributes to the problem of trying to even talk about it. Because, you see, when folks ask questions like, what jokes are okay to tell, they really want a nice, simple answer, something clean and easily understood, just simple rules that apply to everybody in the same way and that aren't just on a case-by-case thing. Well, if you're going to be honest about the reality involved, you can't do that. And I've dealt with the problems of an oversimplified view of complicated things before, specifically when I talked about the question of whether or not only trans actors should be allowed to play trans characters. There, as here, the entire thing involves a lot of nuance, a ton of context, and that context often shifts drastically on a case-by-case basis. So many people want it to boil down to either people can be joked about or they can't. Either everybody is allowed to tell any joke or nobody gets to tell that joke. You can't have it both ways. Oh! A world free of context would be so simple. This kind of thing only works on an even playing field where all groups are on comparable standing, both historically and representationally, and that is just not the world we live in. Maybe one day, but not yet. And trying to behave as if things are equal when they aren't, that's how the status quo gets entrenched. So we can't take the overly simplistic route. We need to inject some nuance into this sucker. Chapter 2. Context is everything. Since I'm not going to be arriving at a neat and tidy conclusion, let me get my broad feelings in here early, so folks at least have a set of the mindset that I am approaching this thing from. Basically, I agree with the following quote from the late, great George Carlin. He said, "I believe you can joke about anything. It all depends on how you construct the joke." And ultimately, I think that is the closest we can get to an answer to this question that is short and pithy. I am of the mind that any topic is fair game. However, not every target is fair game, and whether or not it is depends heavily on who is telling the joke. Now, It should go without saying that this is always going to be execution dependent. If the joke isn't actually funny, then really none of this even matters. You already tripped at the first hurdle and broke your nose in the fall. So, let's now distinguish between the topic of a joke and the target of a joke. Because it is true that nearly every joke ultimately is at the expense of somebody, be they individual or group. I mean, think in terms of a punchline. The punch has to be aimed at somebody. So, to bring it back to that episode of Cheers that I mentioned, I felt that it held up extremely well precisely because of this distinction. Gay men were the topic of the overarching joke of that episode, but they weren't the target. The target was ultimately the people expressing the prejudice. So, the big final joke of the episode involves gay men without gay men being the punchline. In the end of the episode, the punchline is at the expense of Norm, who is the character displaying prejudice most prominently throughout the episode. This isn't to say that gay men actually can't also be a target and have it work, but that's where the added context of who's telling the joke and why they're telling it comes into play. It's a well-remarked phenomenon that people are empowered to laugh at their own community, their own culture, to a degree that those outside of that community and culture aren't. Oftentimes, that has to do with just knowing enough about a community or culture to send it up properly. ContraPoints pointed this out in a video where she noted that people outside of a given group often lack the knowledge to make any observations or jokes about that group beyond the most obvious ones. So often, jokes made about, say, gay people by straight people, or about trans people by cis people, or whatever, are just really lazy and obvious and tired because the joke teller doesn't know enough about their target to go beyond surface level, and you're left with a very shallow and clumsy joke, and that's tripping at the first hurdle again. So, to turn that around, though, from my vantage point, there's often something of a pass given to joke tellers who come from within the targeted group, even if the jokes aren't very good. And I speak from experience here because I've been to plenty of comedy shows. I've seen gay male comics make broad, obvious, stereotyping jokes at the expense of gay men, jokes that don't get called out and would go over very poorly if they were said by a straight comedian with no standing in the LGBTQ plus community. Again, this doesn't mean the obvious joke that these comics tell suddenly works just because they are also gay, but the joke failing isn't usually looked upon as harshly because of who's saying it. Well, that's the theory anyway. Let's take a look at it in practice. Let's talk about what happened earlier this year with Kevin Hart and the Oscars. So, to recap quickly, in case you forgot, comedian Kevin Hart was originally tapped to host the 2019 Academy Awards. Some old comedy routines and homophobic tweets were brought up, and he ultimately pulled out of the gig. I don't actually want to talk about that series of events, but to get to my actual point, the context is necessary, as it always is. So, in the wake of all this, Nick Cannon attempted to defend Hart by dredging up some tweets by comedian Sarah Silverman, in which similar homophobic language appeared. Cannon basically was asking the question that if she's not being punished for this, then why is Hart? It was fairly swiftly pointed out by several prominent members of the LGBTQ plus community that Silverman had long been an active ally, participating in charities and advocating for their rights. Kevin Hart has not. Now, that doesn't make one of them an inherently better person, but it does mean that Silverman has standing within the community. She has social capital, goodwill, and has earned the benefit of the doubt, and Hart just doesn't have that. And that's not a criticism of him as a person, it's just a fact. Silverman and a number of other noted comedians such as Kathy Griffin and the late Joan Rivers would frequently make incredibly obscene jokes about gay men at fundraising events for gay causes. and it was considered to be okay because the targets of the joke knew that these were not coming from a place of hate due to the background and history and context of the person saying it. So while Cannon's attempt to defend Hart may have been well-intentioned, it didn't take the full context of the speakers into account. And that stripping out of context really is the big hang-up. When these arguments about jokes blow up, it's usually because one or both sides of the debate are either failing to account for or are simply willfully ignoring the full and proper context, because the problem is never truly just the joke in and of itself. Chapter 3. Base Assumptions. Context isn't the only thing that gets murky in all this, because there's another element at play, and that is the answer to the question, what are the base assumptions of the joke? A base assumption is something that is taken as a given in the context of a joke. It's something that is presumed the audience already knows about, or a perspective that is presumed they agree with. All jokes have base assumptions, because otherwise comedians would have to explain every single element of the joke as they go, and it would take forever and it wouldn't be funny. I mean, at a basic level, think of any priest and a rabbi joke. It wouldn't work if the person listening didn't already know what those things are on some level. Or how any topical joke assumes the audience already knows about the celebrity or event or news item that's being referenced. Additionally, sometimes the base assumption is that certain things are inherently funny, or at least will be, to an audience that the joke is being told to. Think about how much humor is built on the presumed inherent humor value of a fart, or a small child swearing, or just getting hit in the face with a pie. The presumed shared pieces of knowledge and inherent comedic values are examples of base assumptions that jokes will get built on. They're not the jokes itself, but the jokes stand on the foundation of them. So, I'm going to take a look at two gay jokes. One that I feel falls on its face, and one that holds up surprisingly well despite its age. However, both operate on certain base assumptions that are kind of problematic regardless. Firstly, from Mel Brooks' History of the World Part 1, we have the scene with the Roman emperor. And he has an assistant who is mincing and effeminate, and eventually this culminates in the emperor turning around and going,
"Okay, f*** it, what's next?"
Now, part of the impact of the joke is the shock value, not of the actual word, which would now be shocking more than it was then, but actually just the open acknowledgement at all. Because for context, it needs to be pointed out that these kinds of characters appeared all the time, but were rarely ever openly acknowledged as gay by slur or otherwise. It's a holdover from the Hays Code, which was a set of self-imposed rules Hollywood operated under from 1930 to 1968. And I've talked about it before, but filmmakers weren't supposed to ever depict gay characters on screen, or at least they were not supposed to admit that that was what they were doing.
The little f*** gets it.
But setting shock value aside, the big problem with this entire bit is that it operates on the base assumptions that one, only gay men act this way, and two, stereotypically effeminate gay men are simply inherently comedic. His limp wrist, his lisp, his cooing, they're treated as an inherent joke, as things that are deserving of mockery just for their existence. These behaviors wouldn't be on display for as long as they are otherwise, if it wasn't believed that they were inherently funny. It doesn't need to be drawn out for the shock joke to work.
Boy, when you die at the palace, you really die at the palace.
Now contrast that with the famous final joke from Some Like It Hot. Now that film centers around two men who masquerade as women in order to hide out from the mob. Now one of those men, played by Jack Lemmon, finds himself on the receiving end of another man's affection. This one played by Joe Brown. At the end of the film, as these two characters speed off in a boat, Lemmon, still dressed as a woman, keeps giving reasons he hopes will cause Brown to break off his romantic pursuit. Lemmon says that he smokes. He says he can't have children. But when nothing works, he finally pulls off the wig and declares,
I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect.
That is genius. That final punchline said out of affection by a man who fell in love with somebody and doesn't really care what that person's gender is. Honestly, the punchline is so delicate, it can almost feel like it doesn't have a target at all. It is an adorable, sweet, and immensely funny payoff to the entire relationship. It is a truly brilliant joke. But it does still operate on a troublesome base assumption, which is that Brown's response is only funny because it is unexpected and inappropriate. The joke, great as it is, only works if it's assumed that the correct response would have been revulsion or confusion or basically anything other than what we see. It assumes that a man, upon learning he was attracted to another man, should be disgusted. And the unexpected divergence from that is what makes it funny. Accurate for the time, though that assumption may be, it is unpleasant all the same when you actually break it down. Chapter 4. Most humor ages like milk. Now, I didn't dig into that last example intending to ruin a great joke, but instead to point out one of the underlying reasons behind why humor very frequently does not age very well. Because it's not just shock humor that ages poorly. Honestly, it's most jokes, period. And a major reason is that our base assumptions as a society shift. We come to better understandings of people. Common knowledge, it shifts to a different place. And the acceptable standards shift along with it. Old assumptions become outdated and get discarded. The result being that jokes which depended on the old assumptions become either ineffectual or cringe-inducing. This is the source of that rather trite observation, "You couldn't tell that joke today." Now, most people say that as a condemnation of an overly sensitive PC society. But I would argue that it isn't a case of you can't tell that joke today, but it's more a case of that joke doesn't work anymore because the base assumptions the thing is built on are no longer the accepted truth, and then the whole thing just falls apart. Let's take a few more contrasting examples just to play this out in practice. Everybody likes Monty Python, right? I know I do. I love those crazy Brits. And last year when I expressed my adoration for Life of Brian specifically, and I forget what video, or maybe it was a live stream, I was asked about whether or not a specific character in it was a vehicle for transphobic humor. So, in Life of Brian, there is a character who is initially presented as Stan. He's part of a dysfunctional political group called the People's Front of Judea, who opposed the Romans near the start of the BC AD changeover. And there's a point early on where Stan expresses a desire to be a woman.
What? I want to be a woman. From now on, I want you all to call me Loretta. What?
And it's very much meant to be humorous. Here's why I personally feel the joke works even now. And again, others may take offense. I am not saying I'm the end-all be-all authority on this. This is just my perspective. While initially confused, Loretta's friends are actually pretty accepting of the general idea of her being a woman, and even later in the film, we see moments of them doing their best to properly gender her and apologizing for a slip-up.
Oh, sorry, Loretta. Read that back, would you?
The only point of specific mockery is that part of the reason why Loretta wants to be a woman is that she wants to have babies, which, of course, is a physical impossibility, and also not a reason any real-world trans woman undergoes a transition. It's such an absurd reason for wishing to transition that it comfortably lands as a parody of wishing for an unrealistic outcome, which fits in directly with the broader parody that is the People's Front of Judea as a whole, because this is a group with deeply unrealistic goals, a very nebulous agenda, and ineffectual means of achieving any of it. And the group ultimately resolves that even though Loretta can't have babies, she can have the right to have babies. And they will fight for that, as pointless as it would actually be in practice. Again, I don't believe it to be a joke targeted at the expense of a trans person. It is a broader joke that is about this kind of political group, and it's using a trans character to illustrate an aspect of that. And the base assumptions about poorly organized political movements are, Well, they're still pretty solid, even now. Now let's contrast that with the classic Monty Python sketch, The Lumberjack Song, which, as iconic as it is, does ultimately end up being a case of the very idea of a man in women's clothes is funny, ha ha ha.
I put on women's clothing and hang around in bars.
And with increasing understanding of gender identities and how arbitrary many supposed masculine or feminine traits are, the base assumptions of this sketch, they do not hold up anymore. Oh, and if anybody's wondering about the fact that the Pythons often play female characters, usually dowdy old women, I don't consider that to be transphobic either, because they're not playing trans characters, they're flat out playing women. The fact that they're clearly men adds to the absurdity of whatever it is going on. And in those sketches, the fact that they're being played by men is never the joke, or even really an aspect of it. You could have had the same sketches done with actual female actors, and the jokes play exactly the same. I don't have a great transition for this next point I'm about to make, but it needs to be addressing, so here we go. Chapter 5, Punching Down Humor. So, circling back to the target of a joke, there's also the issue of punching down humor, which is a practice most people do consider to be in poor taste. Broadly speaking, punching down humor is when someone with privilege tells jokes at the expense of people lacking that same privilege. Now, in the interest of not opening up the debate of what is or isn't privilege, because that's a conversation that would completely overtake this video, let me lay out a hypothetical example that I think most folks can roll with. Let's say that a comedian was well known for being a millionaire. That's a big part of their persona. It's a widely known fact about them. They base a good chunk of their act around that fact. Actually, scratch that. Let's just say that Jeff Bezos decided he's going to try his hand at stand-up comedy. There we go. So now imagine his set is built primarily around telling jokes about the homeless and the unemployed and people on food stamps, people who need to work overtime or work 2 jobs to get by. Imagine his punchlines questioning the value of those people, their importance and their intelligence. A man with preposterous amounts of money joking that people with less than him must be worthless idiots. Basically,
you really should have thought of that before you became peasants.
Without the layer of irony. That, at possibly its purest level, would be the essence of punching down humor. Someone on firm standing picking on someone they consider to be beneath them. It's the nobles mocking the peasants. There aren't a ton of universal rules in comedy, but don't punch down is one of the few most agree on, unless it's actually their goal to piss off the audience. Now, sometimes a comedian might actually get away with punching down humor, depending on who the target group is and whether or not there are any members of said group in the audience. I.e., Jeff Bezos could probably get away with telling those jokes in a room full of other billionaires. But that could also lend a false sense of it being okay in the broad sense, only for it to bite him in the ass when he tries to play those exact same jokes in a more diverse crowd than he's used to, like, say, a local coffee house at an open mic. This is another factor that contributes to the phenomenon of aging comedians complaining about how their old routines don't fly anymore. They have a tendency to peg this on artificially enforced political correctness, but I would posit that they are playing to crowds that are either diverse enough that the groups they're making jokes about are now actually present, and those people aren't just smiling and nodding quietly anymore. I mean, notice how many aging comics complain about college crowds. We live in an age where, thanks to things like social media, underprivileged people feel more empowered to speak up than has historically been the case. Where things get muddy again is that issue of what does or doesn't qualify one group as being more privileged than another, which is why I did the entire hypothetical thing with Jeff Bezos, because I'm pretty sure nobody who'd have an actual good faith disagreement with me on the overall points I'm making would argue that example being anything other than the privileged picking on the underprivileged. It made the point. But in reality, we don't have such universal agreement as to what qualifies as privilege, or indeed whether or not privilege is even a thing in the first place. It is, by the way. And on the far ends of these conversations are always a few who knowingly engage in punching down humor in order to fall deliberately into trying to offend people. Because there are always going to be some people who will immediately do the thing they have been told not to simply because they have been told not to do it. I think I may have accidentally stumbled across an actual universal rule right there. Huh. Go me! Chapter 6. Conclusion? So yeah, like I said at the start, I don't have a simple one to give you. Much like life in general, it's complicated. There's a lot at play when the question of what jokes can be told and who can tell them comes up. There's who's telling the joke, what's the topic of the joke, who's the target of the joke, how well does the speaker understand the target group or individual, what assumptions does the joke depend on, is the speaker engaging in punching down humor, and other stuff that I'm honestly probably not even thinking to account for. Now, that's a heck of a lot to have to try and juggle in order to just try and make people laugh. And humans are nothing if not lazy. We don't want to make those kinds of calculations every time we want to tell a joke. So we strip out the context, and we yell the resulting punchy soundbite at each other. Which only fuels the anger, because when people take simplistic, opposing, far-end views, they will never find middle ground. And for that very reason, I don't have a nice punchy finish to this thing. Because punchlines are hard. And I am no comedian. So jokes. Who gets to tell them? Have I broken this down in a way that makes any sense? Am I completely off my rocker? If you want to disagree with me, I welcome it. I would encourage you to do so politely, however. Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comment. Let's talk about it. You can support this channel on Patreon. It helps me cover my bills and grow this channel into something bigger, better, and more ambitious. Plus, there's the like and the subscribe always there. Much appreciated. The like button especially has been a big help lately. There's other links down there additionally as well. Check them out. Click on them. They will take you places, but you also don't have to. Because just like I couldn't tell you exactly how to parse this question, I'm not going to tell you what to do with those links either. Because at the end of the day, you're the council, I'm just running the meetings, and until next time, this council is adjourned.